In 1620, a battered ship crammed with religious refugees dropped anchor off the wrong coast of America, and one of the deciding reasons its passengers were dumped onto a freezing shore instead of carried somewhere safer was this: the crew was running low on beer. One passenger later wrote in his journal that the sick and desperate were forced off the ship and made to drink water so that the sailors could keep the last of the beer for the voyage home. People were left to face a brutal New England winter, and hundreds would die, in part over a shortage of a drink you can now buy for a couple of dollars a can. That sounds insane, but the fact that people once treated beer as more essential than safe harbor, that empires ran on it, paid wages in it, and passed laws that drowned you for watering it down, tells you something. Beer was never just something to get drunk on. It never was. So how did a cloudy, sour porridge brewed in the Stone Age become the third most popular drink on the entire planet, after water and tea? How did it help invent farming, writing, cities, and the modern factory, and end up in almost every fridge on Earth? To understand that, you have to go back further than almost any other thing in your kitchen, back roughly 13,000 years, to a cave in the hills of the Middle East. In a cave called Rakefet, in what is now northern Israel, archaeologists studying an ancient burial ground made a discovery that stunned them. Ground into the stone mortars were the residues of a fermented drink made from wild wheat and barley, brewed by a people called the Natufians around 13,000 years ago. It is the oldest physical evidence of alcohol ever found, and here is the staggering part. It is older than farming, older than bread as we know it. These were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who had not yet settled down to plant fields, and yet they were already brewing beer, probably for ritual feasts to honor their dead. This feeds one of the great debates in archaeology, a theory more than 60 years old. Which came first? Bread or beer? Did humanity settle down and invent agriculture to bake loaves or to brew a buzz? We may never know for certain, but the fact that we have to ask, that beer might be a reason we became farmers at all, tells you how deep this goes. This was not the crisp golden drink, you know. It was thick, cloudy, low in alcohol, closer to a boozy gruel, but it was the beginning of everything. Once humans did settle and farm, beer moved to the very center of the first great civilization. In ancient Sumer, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that we now call Iraq, beer was not a luxury or a vice. It was food, wages, and worship all at once. The Sumerians brewed it from barley bread and drank it, thick with sediment, through long straws to filter out the floating grain. They loved it so much they gave it a goddess, Ninkasi, the divine brewer, and around 1800 BC someone wrote a hymn to her, a song of praise that, when you read it closely, is also a step-by-step brewing recipe, encoding the process in verse so it could be remembered and sung. One of humanity's oldest surviving poems is, essentially, a beer recipe, and the brewers who followed it were mostly women, running the taverns and the brewing of an entire civilization. That was normal, that was the origin. Beer began as women's work and a woman's gift from the gods. The Sumerians took beer so seriously that it appears in their greatest literature. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest great story ever written down, a wild man named Enkidu, raised among animals, is turned into a civilized human being, partly by being taught to drink beer and eat bread. To the Sumerians, beer was not just refreshment. It was a marker of civilization itself, the thing that separated humans from beasts. It was also serious enough to kill over. When King Hammurabi of Babylon laid down one of the earliest written law codes, around 1750 BC, several of those laws were about beer and the taverns that sold it. If a tavern keeper cheated a customer by watering the beer or overcharging, the punishment was not a fine. She could be thrown into the water to drown. Workers building the temples and canals of Mesopotamia were paid daily in rations of beer, sometimes several liters a day. The same was true 1,000 miles away in Egypt, where beer was woven into nearly every part of life. The labourers who hauled the stones and raised the pyramids at Giza were paid, in part, in bread and beer, issued as a standard daily ration. In the village of the tomb builders, the skilled workers who cut and painted the royal tombs received regular allotments of beer as wages, and archaeologists have found their pay records and even their complaints scratched onto flakes of stone. Egyptians offered beer to their gods, poured it in funerals, prescribed it in hundreds of medical remedies, and buried it with their dead, so the deceased would not go thirsty in the afterlife. There was even a myth in which beer, dyed red, was used to save humanity from destruction by getting a rampaging goddess too drunk to finish killing everyone. Beer was the fuel of the ancient economy and the ancient soul. The people who built the wonders of the world were not paid in gold, they were paid in beer. For the ancient world, beer was also medicine and safety. In an age with no understanding of germs, water from a river or a city well could quietly kill you, but beer was boiled during brewing and mildly alcoholic, which made it far more reliably safe to drink. So beer, and its cousin small beer, a weak everyday version, became the ordinary drink of ordinary people, from Egyptian children to medieval peasants. Now, historians push back on the myth that everyone drank beer purely because all water was poison. People did drink water, and they knew clean springs when they had them. But in the crowded, filthy towns that would come later, a mug of weak beer was often the safer bet, and it carried real calories too. Beer was liquid bread, and for millions of people across thousands of years, it was simply what you drank to get through the day. When the Roman Empire fell and Europe entered the Middle Ages, the torch of brewing passed to a surprising place, the monastery. Across medieval Europe, monks became the master brewers of the continent. They had the land, the literacy, the record-keeping, and crucially the discipline to brew consistently, and beer gave them both nourishment during fasting and a reliable source of income. Some monasteries brewed a rich, strong beer specifically to sustain them through Lent, when solid food was restricted. To this day, a handful of Trappist monasteries in Belgium and the Netherlands still brew some of the most revered beer in the world, an unbroken thread reaching back nearly 1,000 years. But the monks in the towns were also part of a quiet revolution in the drink itself, one plant that would change beer forever: the hop. For most of history, beer had been flavoured with a wild mix of herbs called groot, a blend that could include anything from bog myrtle to hallucinogenic plants, often controlled and taxed by local lords and the church. Then brewers discovered that hops did something no herb had done before. Hops did not just add a clean, bitter flavour, they acted as a preservative, letting beer survive longer and travel farther without spoiling. That changed everything. They had a problem. Beer went stale and sour before it could be shipped or stored. The solution was the hop, and it worked so well that hopped beer became a booming export trade, brewed in bulk in cities like Hamburg and Bremen, and shipped across Northern Europe by the merchants of the Hanseatic League. Beer stopped being purely local and became a commodity moved across a continent, taxed by cities and princes who quickly realised that beer was one of the most dependable sources of revenue they had. Wherever beer flowed, governments followed, taking their cut. A drink brewed in a monastery cellar was now filling the treasuries of kingdoms. That transformation eventually collided with the law. In 1516, the rulers of Bavaria issued a decree that would become the most famous beer law in history, the Reinheitsgebot, or purity law. It declared that beer could contain only 3 ingredients: barley, hops, and water. Part of it was quality control, part was consumer protection against brewers who cut their beer with cheap or dangerous additives, and part was raw economics, reserving precious wheat and rye for bakers so the price of bread would stay down. Notice what is missing from that list of ingredients: yeast. Nobody in 1516 knew that yeast even existed, or that it was the invisible living thing turning sugar into alcohol. They just knew the magic happened. That German purity law is still on the books in modified form today. More than 500 years later, one of the oldest food regulations on earth still in force. A rule written before anyone understood how beer actually worked still shapes how it is brewed. And who was doing much of that brewing for most of European history? Women, still, at home. The medieval brewer was often the housewife, the ale wife, brewing extra ale to sell to neighbours for a bit of income, marking her house with a broom or a tall pole so people knew ale was ready. Here is where one of the internet's favourite stories comes in. You have probably heard that the classic image of the witch, the pointy hat, the bubbling cauldron, the broomstick, the cat, comes directly from these alewives, who were supposedly demonized and driven out of the trade as witches by jealous men. It is a great story, and serious historians say the strong version of it is mostly a myth. Women were not rounded up as witches for brewing, but the pieces are real and striking. Alewives really did wear tall hats to stand out in the market, really did use cauldrons and hang brooms as signs, and really were pushed out of professional brewing over time as it turned into a profitable, male-dominated, guild-run business. The witch connection may be exaggerated, but the erasure was real. Beer started as a woman's craft, and over a few centuries, men took it. If you are finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We dig into the hidden histories behind drinks every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. By now, beer had crossed oceans, which brings us back to that freezing ship in 1620. Beer was so central to daily life that ships crossing the Atlantic loaded barrels of it as an essential provision, more trustworthy than water that turned foul and slimy in wooden casks over long weeks at sea. When the Mayflower's stores ran low, that shortage helped push its passengers ashore at Plymouth rather than sailing on. Beer, in a very real sense, helped decide where America began. And back in Europe, beer was about to be cast as the hero of a national drinking disaster. In the early 1700s in London, cheap distilled gin flooded the city, and the result was a catastrophe now called the gin craze. Gin was strong, cheap, and everywhere, and the poor drank themselves into ruin on it, with soaring crime, poverty, and infant deaths. In 1751, the artist William Hogarth captured the panic in two prints meant to be seen side by side. Gin Lane showed a nightmare of squalor, madness, and a drunken mother letting her baby tumble from her arms. Its companion, Beer Street, showed the opposite. Healthy, prosperous, industrious workers relaxing over honest English ale. The message was blunt. Gin was poison. Beer was wholesome, patriotic, and safe, brewed from British grain by British hands. Beer was recast as the respectable, moral drink, the sober foundation of a working society, precisely because something stronger had become the villain. It is a strange promotion for a drink that had gotten Babylonians drunk for 4,000 years. But beer had always been the everyday drink, and now it was the sensible one too. And in the centuries that followed, beer was woven through the founding of nations, brewed by presidents and farmers alike, an everyday drink for an everyday people. But beer was about to be transformed more in one century than in the previous 10,000 years. The change had two parts, a new kind of beer and a new kind of science. But first, beer became big business. In the 1700s in London, a dark, robust, long-lasting beer called porter became the first beer brewed on a truly industrial scale, produced in vast quantities in enormous vats to slake the thirst of a booming industrial city and its dock workers and porters, from whom it took its name. Some of these vats were so gigantic that in 1814 one of them ruptured at Moose's brewery in London, unleashing a wave of hundreds of thousands of litres of porter that smashed through the walls of a crowded slum. 8 people were killed, several of them mourners gathered in a cellar for the wake of a dead child. People drowned in a flood of beer. That is how large and how heedless the industry had already become. Across the Irish Sea, a brewer named Arthur Guinness had famously signed a 9,000-year lease on a disused Dublin brewery back in 1759 and built his dark stout into one of the first truly global beer brands. Beer was scaling up from the village to the empire, and then came the second revolution in the beer itself. For almost all of history, beer had been what we now call ale, fermented warm and quick by yeast that rises to the top. But in the cool cellars and caves of Bavaria, brewers had stumbled onto something different. A yeast that works slowly at cold temperatures, sinking to the bottom, producing a cleaner, crisper, longer-lasting beer. That was lager, and in the 1800s, as refrigeration and railroads spread, lager exploded across the world, becoming the pale, golden, fizzy beer that most of the planet now drinks. But there was a maddening problem. Nobody fully understood why beer sometimes went mysteriously, ruinously sour. Entire batches would turn bad for no visible reason, and brewers were helpless. Then came the science. In the mid-1800s, the French chemist Louis Pasteur, studying beer and wine, proved that fermentation was the work of a living microorganism, yeast, and that spoilage came from other invisible microbes contaminating it. Beer helped launch the entire science of microbiology. Pasteur even published a book on it. They had a problem. Beer went bad and no one knew why. The solution was to discover that the world is full of invisible living things. And it worked. The final piece fell into place in Denmark. At the Carlsberg Brewery in Copenhagen, a scientist named Emil Christian Hansen was wrestling with that same curse of spoiled beer. In 1883, he figured out how to isolate a single pure cell of good brewing yeast and grow it into a clean, reliable culture, free of the wild yeast that ruined batches. For the first time in history, a brewer could produce exactly the same beer every single time. And in a remarkable gesture, Carlsberg's founder chose not to hoard the discovery. He gave the pure yeast strain away, freely, to breweries around the world. That single act industrialized beer. Combined with refrigeration, bottling, and mechanization, it turned brewing from a craft of guesswork into a global industry churning out identical bottles by the millions. The cloudy, magical mystery of the Sumerians had become a controlled chemical process. But just as beer reached its industrial peak, one country tried to erase it entirely. In the United States, a powerful temperance movement had spent decades blaming beer and the saloon for society's ills, and in 1920 they won. National prohibition banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol across the entire country. For 13 years, one of the world's largest beer markets was, officially, dry. The effect on brewing was devastating. Thousands of breweries, many of them small, family-run operations founded by German immigrants, simply died. Some survived by making near beer, malt syrup, ice cream, or cheese, waiting out the drought. When Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933, only the biggest, best-funded breweries were left standing, and the American beer landscape had been permanently reshaped into a handful of giants selling one light, similar style of lager. Before Prohibition, America had thousands of breweries, many of them small and local. A great number never reopened. It would take most of a century and a craft beer rebellion before American variety recovered. A government had tried to kill beer, and instead it just handed the market to the largest players, which is roughly where the modern world begins. Today, beer is a colossal global industry. The world drinks on the order of 190 billion litres of it a year, and for a long time production has been dominated by a few enormous multinational brewing companies born from wave after wave of mergers that own hundreds of the brands you see on the shelf. A single one of these giants can brew a quarter of all the beer on earth, selling brands that look like proud local rivals but often flow from the very same corporate parent. The village alewife and the monk have been replaced by a boardroom controlling a planet's worth of thirst. The single largest beer-producing and beer-drinking nation on Earth is now China, but measured per person, the champions are the Czechs, who have led the world in beer consumed per capita for more than 3 decades, drinking on average well over 100 litres each per year. Beer so woven into daily life that in some Czech pubs it can genuinely be cheaper than bottled water. And beer still carries the weight of identity everywhere it goes. The vast beer halls of Munich's Oktoberfest, the quiet ritual of the Irish pub, the Belgian monasteries, the corner bar as the working person's living room. For thousands of years, the place where beer is served has been where communities gather, gossip, organise and argue, and more than one revolution has been plotted over a round of drinks. And in the last few decades, a rebellion against the bland uniformity of industrial lager has swept the globe. The craft beer movement, tens of thousands of small breweries reviving old styles, hoppy ales, sour beers and monastery recipes, deliberately reaching back toward the variety that industrialization had flattened. The story had come full circle, from small local brewers to global giants, and back towards small local brewers again. So the next time you crack open a cold one without a second thought, remember what you are actually holding. It carries hunter-gatherers brewing in a burial cave before farming even existed. It carries a Sumerian goddess and a hymn that doubles as a recipe, and workers paid in daily rations who raised the pyramids on bread and beer. It carries a Babylonian king who would drown you for watering it down, monks brewing through Lent, alewives in tall hats, and a ship full of refugees pushed onto a frozen shore because the barrels were running dry. It carries Pasteur bent over his microscope, and the pure yeast a Danish brewery gave to the world. The drink that helped invent civilization, that empires paid wages in and governments tried to ban, is sitting in your hand right now, cold, fizzing, utterly ordinary, waiting to be noticed. Beer was never just something to get drunk on. It never was, and it never will be. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind drinks. We have got a lot more coming.